Okay, so we're going to be looking at the ninth part of this this series here. We're almost there, so we're going to be looking at the Rambam, mostly in Hilchos Brachos, Perek Yud Aleph, Halacha Yud here. So let's just look at this halacha and outline this halacha. The halacha starts as follows. It says that echad osa mitzvah la'atzmo ve'echad osa la'acherim. Okay, so somebody that makes a bracha that does a mitzvah for himself or for somebody else. So before he performs the mitzvah, he has to make a Birchas hamitzvah, and the text of which is asher keshanu mitzvah la'asos, like to do whatever the mitzvah is that you're doing is going to be the rest of the phrase. Aval, so that's the first halacha, that performing a mitzvah for somebody else. And Hilchos Brachos, right? Hilchos Brachos and mitzvah. Okay. The second halacha the Rambam says is about Eino mevarech שהחיינו ela mitzvah she'osa la'atzmo, right? But you only make a שהחיינו on a mitzvah that you are doing for yourself. Okay. And the last halacha, there's three din in here. He says hayu lefanav mitzvahs harbe. If you have a lot of mitzvos in front of you, let's say you're taking your lulav in the sukkah, right? So that's two different mitzvos. You have two different mitzvos in front of you. So eino mevarech asher keshanu mitzvah al hamitzvos, right? So you might think just to save some time, instead of making a bracha on the sukkah and then a bracha on the lulav, just say that you're just going to be doing mitzvos. So you say al hamitzvos instead of on the particular mitzvos, so you bundle them all together. So he says you can't do that. Rather, you have to make a bracha on each and every one. Okay, so that opens up with each of these three things has their own questions. Each of these three dinim that we have in this halacha have their own three questions. So the first is when we talk about performing a mitzvah for somebody else and a berchas mitzvah. So the question is, what about someone who does a mitzvah for someone else? Creates this Aמינה, right? This assumption that maybe a Birchas mitzvah isn't recited, and therefore the Rambam had to explicitly state that it is recited, right? In other words, you wouldn't have to say this halacha unless you would have thought that there's good reason to think that you don't make the bracha. So why is it that the Rambam has to come out and say that even if you're doing the mitzvah for somebody else, then you still have to make a Birchas mitzvah? That should be obvious. What's the Hamitzvos the other way? Right. By the way, that's we constantly go back to that. That's a very important methodological point. When reading a halacha, the first thought that should come to your mind is, why is this halacha necessary to be stated? Right. No matter how obvious the halacha is. So in order for us to be reading it, there has to be necessity for it to be there. Okay. The second part is in terms of performing a mitzvah for somebody else now, and a Birchas שהחיינו. So now that I'm doing a mitzvah for somebody else, right? Let's say I'm blowing shofar for them. So according to the Rambam, for some reason that action doesn't allow for a שהחיינו, right? So why, right? What about that? What about someone who's doing a mitzvah for someone else doesn't allow for שהחיינו? Right, the Birchas mitzvah you are going to say, the שהחיינו you're not going to say. So why one versus the other? Okay, and then what's the difference between a Birchas mitzvah, which when the mitzvah is done for somebody else you recite it, and a שהחיינו which isn't recited, right? So that's just the continuation of that question. Okay, in the Kesef Mishnah here, so you see the Ramach had written that a person should recite שהחיינו for someone else when doing a mitzvah for them. Okay, so he says, right? So he says, right? So he says that the svar is that since the other person has an obligation to recite שהחיינו as well, right? So then under the concept of shomea ka'oneh is the vehicle which allows somebody to recite a bracha or do a mitzvah for somebody else, right? How can I make a bracha for somebody else? So, this person's just standing next to me. So what allows this person to fulfill their obligation to make a bracha by my bracha? So there's a vehicle called shomea ka'oneh, which is that by listening and answering, it's as if by answering amen to the bracha, it's as if you are the one reciting the bracha. So shomea ka'oneh. So he says that this other person has to say שהחיינו, right? So now the guy doing the mitzvah can say שהחיינו for them, right? And then under shomei kaona, this guy, right? So he's arguing with the Rambam. Okay, so our question has to be, what's the debate between the Rambam, who says you can't say a שהחיינו for somebody else when doing the mitzvah, and the Ramach, who says you do recite a שהחיינו for them, right? So what's the debate there? Why couldn't the Rambam ascribe to the view of the Ramach that shomei kaona would allow you to make a שהחיינו for the person, right? And or why didn't the Ramach? Well, we don't know what the Rambam's problem is. We know that we haven't said yet. But whatever issue the Rambam has with making שהחיינו for somebody else, why couldn't the Ramach associate with that? Why couldn't he ascribe to that view?
Rabbi, are these talking about a case where the person saying the bracha is fulfilling the mitzvah for himself as well at the same time, or?
Actually, here it doesn't matter so far. Later on, we're going to learn that that's a huge difference, right? That's our next year is going to be that's. But it doesn't really. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference here. That will make a big difference, and it's curious why the Rambam mentions it later but doesn't mention it here. But yeah, okay. So the Gemara has a debate if a person was going to do many mitzvos at the same time, if he says one bracha ala mitzvos or a bracha on each and every mitzvah, right? So we had seen the Rambam that just said that you has to do it every single mitzvah, has to make its own bracha. So the Gemara, right, the Rambam is copying from the Gemara. So the Gemara maintained that in the end, that you do have to recite a bracha on each mitzvah on its own, right? Because the reasoning being that each mitzvah has its own time, right? The Yerushalmi also has a similar debate. So the question is, what's the issue with reciting many brachos at once in one fell swoop? What's the problem with that? What's the issue with making an al mitzvos? Why can't you do that? And then, how do you understand the debate between the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda on this issue about whether you say one bracha al mitzvos or a bracha on each and every one of its mitzvos, right? So to try to understand that debate, okay. The Toscefta, right? So the Toscefta held like Rabbi Yehuda that you make one bracha at a time, and it also wrote that you make one bracha on separating trumos and maasros, okay. So, and the Rambam wrote like this Tosefta, that you recite separate brachos on each separation of Meiser, okay? But if you separate each matana on its own, right? Each you take Truma on its own, you take Maasros on its own, each one on its own, and you don't talk between them, then you make one long bracha of lahafresh Trumas and Maasros. In other words, normally, if I was going to separate Trumas, like let's say Truma, I was going to take away side Truma, so I make a bracha, Asher Kedashanu Tzivanu L'Hafresh Truma, okay? And then let's say, half an hour later, I was going to recite a bracha if I was going to take out Meiser, which is different than Truma, right? So let's say I'm taking out Meiser Ani, right? So I'm going to give for the poor people I have to give this year, right? So Truma for the Kohen I already gave. Now I'm going to be taking out Meiser for the poor person. So it's a half an hour later, so I'm going to naturally make a different bracha, L'Hafresh Maasros. Okay, and now already I have in mind that I'm not allowed to combine brachos into one big mitzvos and make one bracha on all of them, called al mitzvos. But here the Rambam says that you can combine Trumas and Maasros into one big bracha. So that seems to contradict our principle, right? Now our principle was that you can't combine different things, right? So here the Rambam seems to be saying that when it comes to Trumas and Maasros, at least, you're making a bracha specific to Trumas and Maasros, but you're still very much combining. Okay. Okay, so then we have like this. Then you have the Meiri, okay? And the Meiri says as follows. So he brought up a contradiction that it seems in the Gemara's approach, just in the Gemara, to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. In Maseches Sukkah, he maintained that you make a bracha on each mitzvah, right? And the Rabbanan agreed with him. But in Maseches Brachos, he said that you recite a bracha on each type of vegetable, and the Rabbanan disagreed with him. All right, so here the Rabbanan disagree with him and say you can make one, by priyadama. You don't have to make one. Each vegetable doesn't have to have its own bracha where you mention the specific, vegetable's name. So the Miri explained that when it comes to vegetables, they're all like one entity. But when it comes to mitzvos, they each have their own identity, and therefore they need to have their own bracha. Okay. So what does the Miri mean when he says that each mitzvah has its own identity, right? Why, and it's its own entity. Why can't it just be that you have our mitzvos just like you have our priyadama, right? And how would the Miri then explain the halacha that we just saw in the Rambam, that you recite one bracha on all the separations of Trumas and Mitzvos together, right? Aren't they each their own one identity? So how do we differentiate that? Okay. So he explained the problem with the Tanna Kama's opinion that combining mitzvahs into one bracha, right? What was his problem? Is that it makes it seem like the mitzvahs are a burden. Okay, I love kamasui, right? Because I don't want to make so many brachos, right? Who wants to make so many brachos, right? So it looks like it's a burden. We try very much not to have our mitzvahs look like burdens, right? That's something that we try to avoid. So that seems to be violated here, right? So the question you have to ask is the reason why we make separate brachos, like Rav Yonasan Milonil is saying, in order to avoid making it seem like the mitzvahs are a burden, or is it because each mitzvah is its own identity and therefore it requires its own bracha, just like the Gemara and the Meiri wrote, right? That's our question. Okay, right? Because we have two different approaches to it. Okay. The Rivash wrote that the only argument that we have on this issue is in a case where there are two different types of mitzvahs. Okay, then the debate lasts over whether you recite one bracha over each mitzvah or one bracha for each mitzvah. Okay, so how do we understand the Rivash here? Okay, those are our questions. We're flying here. Okay, so but those are our questions. I think we're flying because I didn't read through the sources. I just don't have the patience. But I have an instructor here. That's what it's there for. Okay, so I'm just giving summaries here. Okay. So let's get to the answers. Right, this year I don't have one over. Well, I do, but I have to answer a couple questions before we get to the svara. Okay. So our question about what about someone who does a mitzvah for someone else creates a Havamina, right? We don't hold by this. Creates a Havamina that Birchas hamitzvah isn't recited and had to be explicitly stated that it is recited. Right.
Robert, can I take a crack at that?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe it's because you might have thought if you do it for somebody else, then it's impossible to do it in a casual manner because you have the intention.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Okay, so I say a little bit different, but very good. Okay, so you can't create. I said it like this: you can't create Yiras Hashem in somebody else. That's how I took it. I think we're going in the same direction, just coming from two different paths. But right, if the whole point is for me to make a declaration in order to ensure that I do this mitzvah with Yiras Shamayim, so I can't do that for somebody else, right? So the Havamina is that I wouldn't be able to do it for somebody else, right? Okay, so but we do say it, right? Because now the question is, wait a minute, so hold on, if I can't, that's a true fact, right? That's not just an opinion that I can't have Yiras Shamayim for somebody else, right? So what's the idea? But that's the reason why we do recite it, because that's the whole concept of Shomei Ka'ona, right? The whole concept of Shomei Ka'ona is that this person, right, he becomes me and I become him, right? That's the whole idea. There's a complete and total transference here. So although it would seem like, how could I put Yiras Hashem into your performative actions, but really I can. That is something that I am able to do. Okay. So what about someone who does a mitzvah for someone else, right? Why doesn't that allow a שהחיינו, right? So in the last sugya that we went through, right? So שהחיינו is generated by a happiness that stems from reaching the association with the mitzvah, right? So I can't experience your happiness, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? I can't have your happiness. So so I already heard shofar this morning, right? So I heard shofar. So now, I'm going to, right? I heard shofar. I heard shofar this morning. So I had my happiness already. Blowing shofar again doesn't engender any more happiness. That's it. So I can't experience your happiness. Shomea Kahuna allows me to transfer to you, right? I can now, right? But I can't experience your happiness backwards. And then, it's not a free flowing type of thing. So that, therefore, although I can make the Birchas mitzvah for you, I cannot recite the שהחיינו for you. That can't happen. Okay. Right. So, okay, good. So that answers our two questions, right? Why, and then what's the difference between Birchas mitzvah שהחיינו? Okay, but the Ramach, right, had said that you do recite שהחיינו. He said that Shomea Kahuna does work, right? So, so he felt it could extend, right? So, right. So because he felt that, he gave the example of a woman who was obligated in שהחיינו, right? Because you're blowing shofar for a woman that wasn't in shul. So he felt that the mechanism for Shomea Kahuna is strong enough that it can allow a person to say it to the other person, because Shomea Kahuna does in fact create an extension of the person, right? So the Rambam is approaching Shomea Kahuna as saying that it's transference, right? Right. So I'm transferring it to you, the power, but the Ramach is holding that it's not transference as much as it's an extension. So I become an extension of the person that I'm doing the mitzvah for. So therefore, I can recite the שהחיינו for them. Okay, so let's develop a svara now. The Birchas mitzvah is designed to demonstrate a lack of casualness to mitzvos, right? So the debate about whether to make one bracha on many mitzvos or bracha on each mitzvah centers around whether combining mitzvos under one bracha is still going to ensure yiras shamayim in the fulfillment of the mitzvah, right? Okay, so when there are, right, so let's talk about when there are multiple mitzvahs being fulfilled at once. So what's the issue here, right? And then how would we explain, right? We're going to go through a lot of the different questions, answer them all at once here. So we wanted to know what's the issue with reciting many brachas and mitzvahs at once. How do we explain the debate between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda about whether you do say one bracha ala mitzvahs or a bracha on each and every mitzvah? Okay. We wanted to know if the reason we make separate brachos to avoid it making it seem like the mitzvahs are a burden, like Rabbi Yonatan ben Elil said, or is it because each mitzvah is its own entity and therefore requires its own bracha, right? Which seems like the Gemara and the Meiri wrote, right? And then how do we understand the Rivash? So let's go through them. Okay. So when you recite many mitzvahs at once, you can't ensure the mitzvah is going to be performed with yiras Hashem, because each mitzvah won't be paid attention to with its own bracha, right? You're just going to say al mitzvah, so you can't really ensure each and every one is going to have its own yiras Hashem. Rabbeinu Yonatan ben Elil and the Gemara and the Meiri explain that the issue with combining mitzvahs under one bracha in the same way. According to Yonatan ben Elil, the combining of brachos as a burden demonstrates no yiras Hashem, right? Because it seems like a burden now, right? How's that? That is the exact opposite of yiras Hashem. But according to the Gemara, by not specifying each mitzvah, you also can't possibly be demonstrating yiras Hashem. So they're just really giving two different explanations as to what's impeding the demonstration of yiras Hashem in your mitzvos. Okay. The Rivash explained that one bracha can be recited over one type of mitzvah, right? So even if there are multiple mitzvahs, because the demonstration is made of yiras Hashem to the type of mitzvah, two different types of mitzvahs require two different brachos. Right? That's why tefillin only require one bracha, because it's the same exact type of mitzvah. Okay, so let's go to the Toscefta, right? So it seemed like the Toscefta and the Rambam were contradicting themselves, right? Why? Because on the one hand, you're supposed to recite a bracha on each mitzvah. On the other, right, when it comes to trumas and maasros, we combine them all into one thing of al trumas and maasros. So how do you explain the contradiction, right? And we wanted to know what the Miri meant when he said that each mitzvah is its own entity. And we wanted to know how the Miri would explain this halacha of Trumas and Maasros, right? So if you remember, we had seen this this Rashba, right? This Rashba here. We had seen this Rashba. The Rashba talked about like different Birchas, different mitzvahs that don't have a Birchas hamitzvah. So we talked about when you give, right? First you separate the Trumas and Maasros, and then there's a different mitzvah of actually giving them to the Kohen, right? So I have to separate them. That now makes sure that the vegetables aren't called what's it called? Aren't called what do I say? They're not tevel anymore, so they're not usher to you. And then you have to give them to the Kohen. So the Rashba, in where he had like 5 different things, if you remember. It's really like 25, but we had seen 5 of them. He wanted to know why there's no bracha on the giving of the vegetables to the Kohen, right? When I actually give it to the Kohen, why is there no bracha? And he had said this interesting thing. He said, Matanas kahuna ein mevarchin on the sinasan, right? We don't give it on the giving. The ein ha'yisrael nosei mishalo. He's not actually giving his own food, right? Rather, it's a Kodesh Baruch Hu is zakahim, right, to the Kohen, and so it's more like you're just transferring stuff that's never yours, right? This is like how many elected officials would look at like taxes, right? Like the income was never yours; it was ours the entire time, right? So that's essentially what how the Rash was explaining what like giving the matanas to the Kohen are. So based on that, you could say that the matanas kahuna are really, all these gifts are really one idea. It's just like tefillin. Right? So you only need one bracha. You can combine them because it's really one entity, Trumas and Mitzvos. It's true that it's 2 separate mitzvahs, just like your Tefillin Shel Roshi and Tefillin Shel Yad are 2 separate mitzvahs, right? But you make one bracha because it's that one entity. So you're not really combining mitzvahs because the mitzvahs are technically already in their own category. How would that work out with our svara? Because you would say that the demonstration of Yiras Hashem has to be applied to the category, not to the, right? As long as it's applied to to one similar category, that's fine. But 2 separate categories of mitzvahs, tefillin and matanas kahuna, those require each separate brachos. And that answers all our questions. Although this is short, I thought this is really one of the better sugyas and parts of this, I think. I like it.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, great. I'll see you next week.
Absolutely. Okay.